Good that you're here. You are, I guess, kind of the guest of honor today here. Last night I did my research at a birthday party, which is always a good thing, and I told people that I would go interview someone who would had given people nutritional advice for a long time, and well, if you start talking about nutritional advice on a birthday party, I'm not sure whether you are used to do that, but you get a lot. Is that something you dare to say to people, that you give nutritional advice? Or?
Not really so much. As an epidemiologist, actually, I tell people that they can eat anything they want to as long as they report it accurately.
Oh, okay. So you've been working in this field for a very, very, very long time. How did you get into the field? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I do have a background in nutrition. In fact, I went to an agricultural college, Michigan State University as well, and studied food science, and then did medical school and got interested in epidemiology. And that was really in the late 1970s. And I realized at that time, looking at the dietary advice that was being given, there were strong recommendations, but when I dug down to look at the basis of those recommendations, there was often very little or almost nothing. For example, people were told to eat 2 eggs a week, not more, and there was not a single study that showed that people who ate more eggs had higher risk of heart disease. So I, at that time, was working on the Nurses' Health Study, this cohort of over 100,000 women, and it was very narrowly focused on oral contraceptives and breast cancer at that time, and I realized this could be a really good opportunity to collect some dietary data because the cohort was being followed for a long time, and we could perhaps provide the empirical evidence that really should be the basis of dietary recommendations. So the early work involved a lot of methodologic work. How do you assess diet in a large population? And then how do you measure how well that assessment is working? So that got me started, and what has unfolded has been more interesting than I ever imagined at the very beginning.
So I think there are 3 cohorts that basically underpin most of.
That's right. The Nurses' Health Study was women in middle age, 121,000 at the beginning. And what we realized, of course, that was just men. It was just women. It would be good to look at men as well. So we added another 52,000 men who were health professionals in 1986. And then there was a lot of indirect evidence pointing to the likelihood that the origins of breast cancer occur in childhood and early adult life, and our cohort and others that had been started by that time were really all looking at middle-aged and older women. It's sort of looking under the lamppost where the cancer's occurring, but a lot of evidence was showing we needed to look earlier in the darkness, perhaps. And so the Nurses' Health Study, too, was designed to look at diet during early adult life, and then we added to look at diet during adolescence as well. So
the cohort which you have been looking the longest at, which one is that?
That's the Nurses' Health Study.
Okay.
That's still ongoing. Almost 90% are still participating, and we really have to attribute the success of the cohort to the participants of themselves, but we're almost at 40 years of follow-up now.
40 years of follow-up, right. Okay. So that's, and I mean, it's, like I said, there's many health advice and many types of nutritional advice, but from those cohorts, from that work, how would you kind of summarize, what can you say about nutritional health?
That's the 1,500 references, but to boil it down to a few.
We have a few minutes.
Perhaps most importantly has been the methodologic work that really does show that we can measure diet. Not perfectly. I knew at the beginning we could never measure it perfectly, but well enough to test hypotheses, to find associations if they really exist. And at the beginning, that was one of the things that was holding nutritional epidemiology back from being born even, was that the conventional wisdom was that within a US population and other populations, everyone ate the same, number one. And number two, you couldn't measure any differences even if they existed, because people would say, I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. And getting around that was really important. When you start to collect dietary data, you realize that not everyone eats the same. There are very large variations. And it doesn't really matter what you ate for lunch yesterday. It's what you eat over a longer period of time. And we can measure that reasonably well. The work that we've on assessment of dietary intake and degree of error in dietary intake has been an ongoing part of the work. But basically, in response to your question, what have we learned? And most fundamentally, we have learned that we can measure diet in large populations and learn about the long-term effects of diet. Just of some examples of specific findings that I think have been important. One is trans fat and its relation to heart disease. That was really completely off the screens of nutritionists when we started looking at this in 1980. And we have shown very adverse relationships with trans fat and heart disease. That was reinforced with the findings from Martin Catan from here, looking at short-term controlled feeding studies. And with trans fat, the findings have been reproduced, controlled feeding studies by Catan and others, and our long-term follow-up studies. And now we've actually removed 85% or so of the trans fat from the US diet. So there's been a huge change based on that. Another, I think, important set of findings has been that total fat is unrelated to pretty much everything. It's basically irrelevant in terms of health, long-term health. The type of fat is really important, but it's in some ways it's harder to do negative studies because you really have to close the door on all kinds of alternative explanations, like you can't measure it, there's not enough variation, those kinds of things. But that, I think, really has been supported by a wide array of evidence now. And this year, for the first time, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee has removed any restriction on total fat consumption, which I think is really important because we were pushing people down a wrong path of unhealthy carbohydrates. The third set of findings has been the importance of carbohydrate quality. And that has turned out to be quite important. And we are seeing some real shifts in the US diet, that there are more whole grains being consumed substantially. And that's been an important, I think, development, not just our work, but other people contributing to that importantly. And maybe one other perhaps is related to carbohydrate quality, the adverse effects of sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. Again, the epidemiologic study in combination with some controlled feeding studies over shorter periods of time really show very clearly many adverse effects of high consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. And there again, that is being translated. We've actually seen a 25% drop in sugar-sweetened beverage consumption in the last 10 years in the United States, which is actually a pretty remarkable change in behaviors. So those, I think it's been gratifying to see the science being reproduced and being translated into actually human diets. Interestingly, which overall in the US have improved quite a bit in a 10-year period.
So consumers are bombarded with health advice, as you very well know, of course. You have your own, I mean, the Harvard Medical School has its own website basically about nutritional advice for people. How much of that would you regard as having solid evidence now? Or is there kind of a gray area where we think it's wise to advise something, but we don't really know for sure?
I think you correctly say that there is a spectrum of certainty. In this area, there are sometimes questions raised. First, can you measure diet? And I think we have a lot of evidence now that we can. There is then the question of what do you need for a level of proof? And there is one extreme end of the spectrum that says you can only believe randomized trials. Unfortunately, if that's what you believe, you will remain very ignorant. You would remain still a smoker. You wouldn't have any worker protection from the occupational exposures. And you reject most areas of science, like environmental science and those kinds of things. They don't operate on randomized trials. So I think in the area of nutrition, it's very hard, if not impossible, to do randomized trials of most questions that we're looking at, because it would involve taking tens of thousands of people and following them for many years, sometimes many decades, to look at the consequences of their diet. So I think the best evidence will usually come with large prospective studies and combined with randomized controlled feeding studies of the intermediate endpoints like blood lipids or blood pressure. And that's what we had for trans fat. And then I think you can make decisions that are very, very solid. You might say not 100%, but very close to 100% certainty.
Because you have been on the receiving end of criticism, of course. Of that.
Oh, there's scars all over my body, yes.
And so people have basically said, well, all you can do is show correlations, show associations, and they're hypotheses at best, but they're not proof whatsoever. And so how do you respond to those people that really that meat consumption is really, red meat is bad for your...
Well, I think it is accumulation of evidence, of putting all the available evidence together and the weight of that evidence. And again, you can be most certain, I think, when you have long-term prospective studies. One of the problems is that randomized trials are very likely to give you wrong answers. And we have good examples. As I mentioned, there are 3 randomized control studies of health effects of smoking cessation. All 3 showed no benefit. Nobody believes that. There are other examples too where you get negative results. The Women's Health Initiative was the biggest randomized trial that was ever done. It cost several $1 billion of 48,000 women randomized to a low-fat diet for up to about 9 years. And in the end, there was no difference in HDL cholesterol or triglycerides at any time during the study, which means there was no appreciable difference in fat intake. That's the worst kind of study that it is completely uninformative about low-fat diets. I think the fact that they didn't find any effect was the right answer, but the study itself does not really contribute to that. So if you want the perfect, or if you require randomized trials as the level of evidence, I think you will just be in a very ignorant state.
So we'll have to do with
I think there is no such thing as a perfect study of any type, and in general we will have to, like we make many kinds of decisions on the weight of evidence. If you, again, go back to climate change, we're doing a lot there. There is no randomized trial of randomized planets to different levels of carbon dioxide.
Well, there's only one Earth, there's more people. But it's so, looking forward, I mean, we've been looking back at your work and what does it show, but I mean, looking forward to the next couple of years, if you would want to set an agenda, and I think you have slides about that.
Sure.
This one?
Yes. There's still a lot to do. I think we've learned a lot, but just to point out a few areas where I think we can do more. One is looking at sort of more extremes of life, of the life cycle, and there's been a lot of interest during about diets during pregnancy, but mostly looking at undernutrition. Barker's work, for example. This is some work looking at adolescent diet, and really we have now really for the first time some data from adolescent period looking at breast cancer. And we are seeing findings, we have relationships that we did not see when we looked at midlife diet. For example, red meat consumption during adolescence we do see related to higher risk of premenopausal breast cancer. And we don't see anything during midlife with red meat and breast cancer. There's also quite a strong inverse association with fiber intake and during adolescence and later breast cancer. Again, it's something we don't see. So there's a lot to be learned looking at dietary intake earlier in life. As far as I know, these are the only data available, and we're going to have to wait quite a while even for someone to reproduce this finding.
Right. So where are these coming from then?
This is Nurses' Health Study 2. It's what I call a retrospective prospective study.
Were they adolescents when they entered the cohort?
No, they were young adult women, and we asked them about their diet during high school.
Okay.
And I won't go into the details. We looked at the comparison with mother's report and some other evidence. It looks like we're getting quite reasonable data. And then we're looking, once we collect the dietary data, we're looking prospectively. So there's no possibility of recall bias or something like that. It's collected in retrospect, but then looking prospectively. The next slide, too, just gives another picture of that. And this is looking at different replacements for red meat in the diet, and everything except fish was inversely related to breast cancer risk. And this also, I think, is an important point in how we analyze our data, that these are what we call substitution analyses, because it's very clear if you reduce something or increasing something substantial in the diet, you always have to replace it with something. And if you don't specify the replacement, then the results could be very confusing or uninformative. So I think it's critical to do replacement or substitution analyses. And to my surprise, we'd been doing it for macronutrients, but we had not been doing it for food. No one really had. And I think it's a very important step forward in the analytic approach we take.
Okay.
And then if I can go, well, you could skip that. We'll go to the next slide. And just to point to the other end of life, where now that people are dying less at middle age of cancers and cardiovascular disease, life expectancy has really gone up quite a bit. Neurodegenerative conditions, particularly dementia, are becoming more important. And so we are looking at that. There's a lot to be done there, but I think this is going to be a very fruitful area for nutrition. This is looking.
What are we looking at? Is poor SML? Can you explain poor SML?
Right, it's a subjective memory loss. It's sort of early stage of memory loss and dementia. That it looks like there's a set of 6 questions that work quite well. They're strongly associated with ApoE4 genotype and MRI imaging changes. So it's something simple to measure that we're now looking at in our cohorts, and we have 40 years of previous dietary intake data from about 100,000 people. So this is looking at Mediterranean diet in relation to subjective memory loss. So there's about a 40% lower risk with a higher score on the Mediterranean type diet. And digging down into what the elements are that are most important is something we're working on now. But other people have looked at some of these same relationships. It looks like there's a lot going on here. This relationship is actually stronger than what we see for cardiovascular disease.
Oh, interesting.
So this is, I think, a big area for nutrition and nutritional epidemiology. And then integration of other new technologies of metabolomics, I think, is going to be useful. Obviously, genomics we've been integrating in for quite a while, and microbiome work. Integrating these new ways of looking at how diet works will be very important. But nevertheless, I still think that assessment of what people are actually eating, diets, in long-term studies is still going to be the backbone here. But these other technologies are more looking at mechanisms, some refinement, but still I don't think there's going to be anything to replace actual assessments of diet in long-term studies looking at human health.
And is that because the effects are smaller, that you need additional methodology to pick those out of the noise, basically?
Well, let me go back to the first slide I had, the colorful one. now we have it, if I could go there just a minute. That is looking at different ways of assessing diet. No, we can go back further to the colorful. Yeah, that's the one. Okay, that's this I can't resist showing a little bit here from our latest work. It's not yet published, but it's the biggest, most expensive validation study that's ever been done, where we have about 700 women in the Nurses' Health Study and Nurses' Health Study 2 with many multiple ways of measuring dietary intake, including a lot of biomarkers. And this is looking, using biomarkers as a measure of validity. These are plasma levels of fatty acids, carotenoids, and folate, and looking at which method of dietary assessment is most strongly correlated with a biomarker. That gives a measure of relative validity, because the biomarkers themselves are quite imperfect for many reasons of differences in absorption metabolism. But as you can see, just taking beta-carotene there as an example, that starting from the right, the sort of brown column, that's 2 weeks of weighed diet records. Very expensive, very burdensome for the participant. And that's sort of the gold standard. The correlation is best for that. And then to the left of that is 1 week of weighed diet records. So you get most of the information from 1 week. And then the orange bar in the middle is average of 2 food frequency questionnaires, which is what we use in our large studies, although we now have 6 or 8 food frequency questionnaires over time. And it does almost as well as the 1 week weighed diet record. We aren't losing much information. And then the blue is the one semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire, is still almost as good. And then 3 days of 24-hour recall and 1 day of 24-hour recall gives you much, much less. So,
okay, so just to make sure that I understand this picture correctly, these are basically different methodologies looking at the same question.
Right, right.
And the higher the bar,
the stronger the correlation, the better the method.
And the closer you get to the truth in your idea.
Exactly. So we know we're not perfect, but we're not losing much by the simple, very, very inexpensive methods that we're using. And that's important because then we can repeat it over time, which even if you had a perfect measurement today or this year, diet doesn't stay the same over time. So having repeated measurements is turning out to be very important. And that same pattern, if you look across the different nutrients, occurs where there's been one group going around in the talks saying that, oh, one 24-hour recall is as good as the food frequency questionnaire. It's clearly way, way, way off target. So I think it's reassuring that the same pattern persists, again, without going nutrient by nutrient, that we're able to capture most of the information. It's really important to repeat that measurement over time. And it does, again, is some of the critical evidence that we can measure diet. Not perfectly. If you wanted perfect measurements, you would not go into this business at all.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, thank you very much, because we have to move on to the next.
Okay.
If you would.
Thank you.
If you take your place at the, I'll